Chapter 3. Stendar's Fury. Velkyre rose from the bed on the third morning with the slow, deliberate care of a man who had learned exactly how much his body would tolerate before it betrayed him. The worst of the pain had settled into a deep, familiar ache. Ribs that protested when he twisted too sharply, the cut on his arm pulling tight beneath its clean bandage. A dozen lesser bruises that bloomed in dull purples and yellows across his skin. He swung his legs over the side of the mattress and set his bare feet on the cool wooden floorboards of the Frost Fruit Inn. For a long moment he simply sat there, breathing, testing the weight of his own frame. When he finally stood, the room tilted only once before steadying. His armor waited where the villagers had left it, polished as best as farmhands could manage. The dark steel still carried the bright scars of silver blades, but the worst of the mud and blood had been wiped away. He dressed without hurry, tunic first, then the heavy breastplate that settled across his shoulders like an old, grim friend. The fur cloak followed, its wolf and bear weight familiar and grounding. Last came the quiver of red-fletched arrows and the axe, the haft of which still bore the faint imprint of Skjor Ironbite's furious grip from 2 nights before. Downstairs, the common room of the inn was quiet in the way of a place that had recently seen too much. The miller, whose name Velkyre had learned, was Rorik. The same as the village itself, waited near the door with a heavy canvas satchel in both hands. The man's salt and pepper beard had been trimmed, and the silver wire cuts on his wrists were neatly bound in clean linen. When he saw Velkyre on the stairs, he straightened, something like pride and lingering gratitude warring in his weathered face. "You're upright," Rorik said, voice rough. "Good. We weren't certain you'd manage it so soon." He held out the satchel as though it weighed more than its size suggested. "It's not much, not coin, most of that went to the taxmen last harvest, but it's food that will keep. Smoked venison from the last stag that didn't go to the garrison. Hard cheese. Dried apples. Flatbread that won't turn for weeks if you keep it dry. A little honey in a sealed pot, and the skin of the apple wine my wife still insists on making, even though the justiciars frown on anything stronger than water." He cleared his throat. "You stood between my neck and a silver axe. This is the least the village can do." Velkyre took the satchel. The weight of it was solid, reassuring, the scent of smoked meat and sweet apple rising from the canvas like a promise of days without hunger. He inclined his head, the closest thing to a bow his sore ribs would allow. "It's more than enough," he said. "Tell the others I'm grateful, and that the porridge was the best I've had in a long while." Rorik's mouth twitched in something that might have been a smile. "Lena will be glad to hear it. She's been hovering near the kitchen since dawn, pretending she isn't waiting to see you walk out under your own power." He stepped aside, holding the door open to the pale morning light. "Road's clear as far as anyone knows. Northwest will take you toward the Karth. Watch the bridges. The Thalmor have been thicker than flies on a carcass since the lightning show. And if you see silver armor on the horizon..." He left the warning unfinished. Velkyre stepped out into the day. Rorik's stead fell away behind him in a scatter of thatched roofs and golden fields still wet with dew. He set his face northwest, toward the distant promise of the Karth River and the citadel that waited beyond it. The satchel of trail rations rode heavy and comforting against his hip. The morning sun climbed slowly, turning the wide plains of Witter and Hold into a rolling sea of bronze and green. Wind moved through the tall grass with a long, sighing sound. Somewhere far off a lone hawk circled on the thermals, its cry thin and sharp as a needle. He walked, the hours unspooled in the steady rhythm of boot leather on hard-packed earth. He passed the blackened husk of an old watchtower that had once flown storm-cloaked colors and now flew nothing at all. He forded a shallow stream where the water ran clear and cold over smooth stones, pausing long enough to refill his waterskin and wash the last of the dried blood from the edge of his bandage. An imperial courier on a lathered horse thundered past near midday, giving him a single hard look before vanishing up the road in a cloud of dust. Later, a pair of farmers driving a cart of late cabbages toward the next market offered him a nod and a warning that the hills ahead had seen more than the usual number of wolves, two-legged and otherwise. The sun had begun its long slide toward the western mountains when the road dipped into a shallow valley, and the peculiar little house came into view. It sat alone beneath a stand of twisted pine, as though the rest of the world had politely decided to keep its distance. The walls were of dark, weathered timber that seemed to lean inward under the weight of a moss-heavy roof. A thin thread of pale smoke rose from a stone chimney. Windows of uneven glass caught the afternoon light and threw it back in warped, watery reflections. A low fence of crooked stakes surrounded a garden that should have been dead with the advancing autumn, yet somehow still held clusters of late herbs and a few stubborn flowers the color of old bruises. The door stood open. Velkyre slowed, one hand resting lightly on the haft of his axe. Something about the place pressed against the instincts that had kept him alive in the Geralds, the same quiet wrongness that had once warned him of saber cats in the high passes, or of ground that looked solid until it swallowed a boot. Yet the smoke smelled of wood and something sweet, almost like baking bread, and the open door was an invitation as much as a warning. He had nearly decided to pass it by when the old woman appeared on the threshold. She was small and bent, wrapped in layers of faded shawls that might once have been every color of the rainbow and had long since faded to the same tired gray. Her hair was a wild tangle of white, pinned back in places with what looked like carved bone. Her face was a map of wrinkles so deep they seemed to hold shadows even in the direct light. But her eyes, bright, black, and unnervingly sharp, lit up with unmistakable delight the moment they found him. "A traveler!" she cried, clapping her hands together with a sound like dry sticks breaking. "And such a fine, strong-looking one, too. Come in, come in, come in. The road is long and the afternoon is growing cold. I have stew on the fire and bread that is nearly done, and a chair that has been waiting for a proper backside to fill it these last 3 days." Her hospitality was so immediate, so overwhelming, that it set Velkyre's teeth on edge even as his empty stomach answered the scent of the stew with a low, traitorous growl. He stopped at the gate, studying her. "I'm only passing through," he said carefully. "Northwest, toward the Carth." "Of course you are, of course you are." She waved a knobby hand as though the entire concept of destinations was a charming but unnecessary fiction. But even men bound for rivers must rest their feet and fill their bellies, I insist. An old woman sees so few faces out here. The least you can do is let me look at a living one for a little while. Come, the stew will not keep forever, and neither will I. She turned and disappeared into the dim interior without waiting for an answer, as though the matter had already been decided. Velkyre stood at the gate for a long moment, weighing the quiet wrongness against the very real hollowness in his gut and the lingering weakness in his limbs. At last he stepped through, one hand still near his axe, and followed her inside. The single room of the house was smaller than it had any right to be, crowded with shelves of cloudy jars, bundles of drying herbs that hung from the rafters like the legs of inverted insects, and furniture that seemed to have been collected from a dozen different decades and then forced to coexist. A black iron pot hung over a low fire, releasing the rich, savory scent of meat and root vegetables. The old woman, she had not offered a name, bustled about with surprising energy, ladling stew into a wooden bowl, tearing a chunk of dark bread from a loaf that still steamed faintly, and setting both on a scarred table beside a clay cup of something that smelled strongly of fermented berries. "Sit, sit," she urged, patting the back of the nearest chair. "You look as though the road has been chewing on you for days. Eat, talk." An old woman grows tired of the sound of her own voice. Velkyre sat, though he kept his back to the wall and his axe leaning against his thigh within easy reach. Soup was better than it had any right to be, rich, well seasoned, the meat tender enough to fall apart on the tongue. He ate slowly, watching her over the rim of the bowl as she settled into the opposite chair and fixed him with those bright black eyes. "You're hurt," she observed, not unkindly. Not the kind of hurt that comes from a simple fall or a bad night's sleep. The kind that comes from silver and bad intentions. She cackled softly. "Don't look so surprised. These old eyes have seen more than most." The silver hand had been stomping about the holes like they owned the night itself, and the golden ones with their lightning and their lists of names. "Well, Skyrim has always been a place where the strong decide what the weak must endure. You're heading northwest, you said, toward the Karth, toward solitude, toward that new pile of stones they call the Citadel of Stendar." She said the name with a peculiar little twist of her mouth, as though it tasted both amusing and faintly sour. Velkyre set the empty bowl down. "You hear a great deal for someone living alone on a side road." "I hear what the wind brings," she replied, smiling with too many teeth. "And travelers bring the rest. Tell me, strong one, when you reach that citadel, what do you think you'll find? Silver and sermons. Men who claim to fight the dark while polishing their own armor to a blinding shine. Or something that looks very much like the same hunger you've already met, only wearing a different face." The conversation wound on through the deepening afternoon. She asked about the road behind him, about the vampire in the Blackwoods, about the fight in Rorikstead, about the Thalmor Inquisitor who had come to test his words. Each question was wrapped in concern and curiosity, yet each one probed a little deeper than simple hospitality required. Velkyre answered with the same careful honesty he had given Kalinin, revealing nothing that could be turned into a blade. All the while the old woman smiled and nodded and refilled his cup with the strong dark berry wine that left a lingering warmth in his chest, and a faint, unfamiliar fuzziness at the edges of his thoughts. The light outside the warped windows had turned the color of old brass when he finally decided he had stayed long enough. He rose, thanking her for the meal, and turned toward the door. That was when his boots scuffed against something that did not belong. The floorboard beneath the edge of the table was slightly raised. The difference was almost nothing, a fraction of an inch, easy to miss in the cluttered dimness. Yet the years in the Gerals had taught him to notice the almost nothings. He crouched, running gloved fingers along the seam. The board lifted with surprising ease, revealing a narrow iron latch set into the wood below. The latch was old, the metal pitted with rust, and the lock that should have held it closed had been broken clean through, sheared by some heavy blade or simply forced until the mechanism gave way in a spray of brittle fragments that still lay scattered in the dust. Beyond the broken lock, a set of narrow stone steps descended into darkness that smelled of cold earth, old iron, and something faintly sweet and rotten that did not belong in any ordinary cellar. Velkyre looked up. The old woman was watching him from her chair, the bright black eyes no longer quite so grandmotherly. The smile she wore now was small and knowing, as though the discovery had been inevitable all along. "Well," she said softly, "it seems the house has decided to show you its secrets after all." Velkyre's fingers closed around the broken latch. The iron was cold and flaking with rust, the sheared metal edges still sharp enough to catch the leather of his glove. He glanced once more at the old woman. She remained seated, hands folded neatly in her lap, the bright black eyes fixed on him with the patient interest of a crow watching a dying animal. The smile she wore had not changed, yet something behind it had begun to uncoil. He descended. The stone steps were narrow and uneven, worn smooth in the centers by feet that had come and gone in secret for longer than the house above had any right to stand. The air grew colder with every step, thick with the scent of damp earth, old blood, and a sweet rot undertone that clung to the back of the throat like spoiled honey. At the bottom, the darkness opened into a chamber far larger than the modest dwelling overhead should have allowed. Velkyre paused on the final stair and let his eyes adjust. The basement was a shrine to things that should never have been brought into the light. Black candles of congealed fat burned in niches cut into the walls, their flames burning a sickly green that cast long, crawling shadows across every surface. Bones, human and otherwise, hung from the low ceiling on cords of braided hair and sinew, turning slowly in the unseen currents of air. A low stone altar dominated the center of the room, its surface stained in overlapping layers of brown and rust red. Upon it rested a collection of objects that made the skin along Velkyre's arms tighten. A dagger of blackened meteoric iron whose hilt was wrapped in what looked like flayed Reachman skin. A bowl of polished bone filled with a thick, tar-black liquid that still steamed faintly. A cluster of human hearts, some fresh enough to glisten, others dried into leathery husks, each pierced through with a thorn of briar. Daedric's script crawled across the walls in pigments that looked uncomfortably like blood mixed with ash. Symbols of Namara, of Hircine, of Molag Bal, overlapping and intersecting in patterns that hurt the eye if stared at too long. In one corner, a crude effigy of twisted branches and black feathers watched the room with empty sockets that had once held living eyes. Witchery, active, recent, and steeped in the kind of power that did not come from any of the 8 divines. Velkyre's hand settled on the haft of his axe. The red-fletched arrows at his back suddenly felt very light and very insufficient. Soft footsteps descended the stairs behind him. The old woman, no longer quite so old, no longer quite so bent, stopped on the 3rd step from the bottom and looked over the chamber with the quiet pride of a craftsman surveying a finished work. When she spoke, the grandmotherly cadence was gone. The voice that emerged was deeper, rougher, edged with the dry rasp of a creature that had lived too long on blood and spite. "You have sharp eyes for a surface dweller," she said. "Most who find the latch turn and leave. Few try to run. Fewer still make it past the garden." She descended the final steps, and with each one the illusion of harmless age peeled away like rotting cloth. The bent spine straightened. The wrinkled hands lengthened, fingers sprouting dark, curved talons. The wild white hair thickened and coarsened into a mane of blackened feathers and matted grey. When she finally stood at her full height in the green candlelight, the thing that faced him was no longer a woman at all. The Hagrid, one of the powerful ones. The kind the Reach whispered about in the dark. Her beak-like nose twitched as she scented the air. The black eyes that had seemed merely sharp upstairs now burned with a deep, smouldering amber. "I am Matriarch Grista of the Thorn Circle," she said. the name dropping into the chamber like a stone into still water. And you, Velkyre Reborn, have walked into the heart of something far older than your little war between Empire and Stormcloak. She began to pace slowly around the altar, talons clicking against the stone. The green candle flames leaned toward her as she passed, as though hungry for her presence. You have been walking through a land that no longer belongs to the people who claim it. Listen carefully, Surface Man, for I will not repeat myself. When the Second War ended, finished scouring the last open worship of Talos from the holds, the Empire found itself overstretched and underfed. Markarth, proud, bloody Markarth, was a bleeding wound they no longer wished to tend. So they sold it, quietly, officially. The entire city and the reach around it passed into the hands of the Silver Blood family for a sum of gold and a promise of continued loyalty. The Empire washed its hands. The Silver Bloods took the throne of stone and began squeezing the reach even harder than before. She paused beside the bowl of black liquid, dipping one talon into it and watching the thick drops fall back with soft, wet sounds. But the reach remembers, the Forsworn remember, and we, that have always walked the deep places, remember most of all. While the Nords and the Elves and the Imperials were busy burning each other's banners, we grew strong. The Thorn Circle has bound the largest of the Forsworn tribes to us with briar and blood, and the promise of a reach free of foreign kings. We have already taken the high camps in the hidden valleys. The Western Wilds answer to us now. Markarth will be next, then the rest of the reach, and after that, she smiled. A terrible expression on a face that was more beak and feather than flesh. After that, who can say how far the thorns may spread? Velkyre is back to the wall of bones, axe held low and ready. The air in the chamber had grown heavier, charged with the same wrongness he had felt at the garden gate. Why tell me any of this? Grista's amber eyes narrowed with something like amusement. Because you are useful. Or you are dead. Those are the only two roads that leave this room. You have already faced a daughter of Cold Harbor and lived. You have stood against the Silver Hand and forced even the Tharma to take notice. That kind of strength does not appear often among the soft people of the surface. The Circle can use it. The Forsworn can use it. Kneel. Take the briar into your chest. Become something more than a wandering hunter with a pretty axe and a death wish. Serve the reach that is coming, and you will have power the Empire, and the Dominion have long forgotten how to fear. She lifted one hand, and the green candle flames flared higher, casting her shadow huge and monstrous across the far wall. Refuse, she said almost gently. And I will open you here on this altar and read the future of my people in your steaming guts. The choice, Surface Man, is simple. Her amber eyes locked on his. Join us or die. The ultimatum still hung in the green-tinged air between them, heavy as the scent of old blood and spoiled honey when the knocking came. 3 sharp raps against the front door upstairs, firm, insistent. The sound of someone who had already decided they would not be turned away. The noise traveled down the narrow stone steps and into the basement shrine like a stone dropped into a deep well, breaking the charged silence with almost physical force. Then the voice followed, bright and breathless and painfully familiar. Hello? Is anyone there? I'm looking for a man, tall, dark armor, red arrows on his back. His name is Velkyre. Please, I only need a moment. I brought something for him. A gift. I've been walking since first light, and Lena, the miller's daughter. The bashful girl with wheat-colored hair and freckles who had asked to follow him and been refused. Her voice carried down the stairwell with the clear, slightly nervous cadence of someone standing on an unfamiliar threshold, trying to sound braver than they felt. Velkyre's blood went cold. She had followed him. She must have. The road northwest from Rorikstead was not so heavily travelled that a determined young woman on foot could not keep a lone figure in sight if she stayed far enough back among the folds of the land. He pictured her moving through the tall grass at a careful distance, watching the peculiar little house take him in, waiting until she could no longer bear the not knowing. The special gift she claimed to carry was almost certainly an excuse. Something small and earnest clutched in her hands while her heart hammered with the same fierce hope he had already turned aside once. Matriarch Grista's amber eyes flicked upward toward the ceiling. The terrible smile that stretched across her beak-like face was slow and delighted, as though the interruption were a particularly fine vintage she'd been saving. "Company," she rasped, the word dripping with dark amusement. How thoughtful of the little surface girl to deliver herself. I do so dislike having to hunt when prey insists on walking straight to the door. She moved with sudden, liquid speed. One taloned hand swept toward the low stone archway that framed the bottom of the stairs. Words in a language older than the Empire scraped from her throat. Guttural, wet, wrong. The green candle flames flared in answer. A lattice of thorny briars erupted from the bare earth of the basement floor, weaving themselves into a dense living barrier across the stairwell with the sound of 1,000 dry twigs snapping at once. The briars thickened as they rose, their barbs glistening with a viscous black sap that smoked faintly where it dripped. In the space of 3 heartbeats, the only exit had become a wall of living knives. Grista was already climbing. She did not bother with the steps. Her clawed feet found purchase on the rough stone walls themselves, carrying her upward in a rapid, scuttling rush that sent loose fragments of mortar raining down into the chamber. Feathers and matted hair brushed the low ceiling. Her voice floated back to him, almost playful. "Stay and consider my offer properly, surface man. The briars will not open for you. I will deal with the girl, gently, if she proves useful, or messily if she does not, and then we will finish our conversation. Try to run, and the thorns will open you from heel to throat. Try to burn them, and the smoke will teach you why the Reach still fears the old magics." She vanished through the upper doorway. The heavy wooden door of the house itself slammed shut a moment later with a finality that echoed down the sealed stairwell like the lid of a coffin. Velkyre stood alone in the green-lit dark, the lattice of living briars blocking the only way out, the sound of Lena's voice still calling faintly from the world above, and the knowledge that the Hagraben was even now moving toward the one person in this forsaken corner of Skyrim who had come looking for him out of nothing more dangerous than gratitude and lonely hope. Velkyre's heart dropped like a stone into black water. Lena's voice still drifted faintly through the sealed stairwell, bright, hopeful, utterly unaware of the thing that was even now climbing toward her. The lattice of living briars blocked the only way up, thickening even as he watched, black sap dripping from their barbs in slow, smoking threads. For a single frozen heartbeat, the green candlelight and the hanging bones and the terrible altar seemed to press inward, trying to crush the air from his lungs. Then he moved. The axe came free in a single savage motion. He threw himself at the barrier, steel flashing in great overhand arcs that should have cleaved living wood like kindling. The first blow sank deep into the nearest cluster of thorns and stuck fast. The briars reacted as though insulted. They writhed, tightening around the embedded blade, and when he wrenched it free, a spray of black sap hissed across his forearm, burning like acid through the sleeve of his tunic. He struck again, and again. Each impact sent jolts up his already bruised arms. The thorns parted only enough to close tighter a moment later, knitting themselves back together with the wet sound of flesh knitting over a wound, ever growing, ever hungry. Frustration rose in him like a red tide. He abandoned technique and simply flailed, wild, reckless, two-handed swings that filled the chamber with the sound of splitting wood and his own ragged breathing. The axe head glanced off a particularly thick knot of briar, and the momentum carried him sideways. His hip slammed into a low shelf he had not noticed in the green gloom. Pottery shattered. A heavy jug of lamp oil, cloudy, yellow, reeking of old fish and tallow, toppled from its place and burst against the stone floor. The liquid spread in a gleaming black pool, rushing toward the nearest cluster of fat candles with the speed of something that had been waiting for exactly this moment. One candle, knocked askew by the same impact, tipped. The flame kissed the oil. The basement became a living throat of fire. It happened faster than thought. The pool ignited with a hungry warmth that sucked the air from the chamber and replaced it with a wall of orange heat. Flames raced across the floor, climbed the bone-hung walls, licked up the legs of the altar. The hanging hearts began to shrivel and blacken. Daedric symbols painted in blood and ash flared once as though in protest and then peeled away in curling sheets of ash. Smoke, thick, choking, boiled upward. Velkyre staggered back, one arm flung across his face, the heat already blistering the exposed skin of his hands and the right side of his neck. His cloak smoldered at the edges. The red-fletched arrows in his quiver began to crackle. The briars screamed. There was no other word for the sound that tore from the living lattice as the fire reached them. They recoiled like a single wounded animal, thrashing, blackening, pulling back from the stairwell in a frantic hissing retreat. The path upward opened in a tunnel of flame and dying thorns. Velkyre ran. He plunged through the gap while the briars were still falling away, the heat searing his shoulders and the backs of his legs. Something in his cloak caught fully alight. He ripped the burning fur from his body and left it behind on the steps like a discarded skin. The stone stairs scorched the soles of his boots. Smoke clawed at his throat and eyes. By the time he burst through the upper doorway into the single room of the house, he was coughing hard enough to taste blood, the right side of his face raw and tight. The sleeve of his tunic burned away to the elbow, and the flesh beneath already blistering. He did not slow. The front door still stood ajar from Lena's arrival. He slammed through it into the late afternoon light, axe in hand, lungs dragging at the clean air like a drowning man. The garden was exactly as it had appeared from the road, impossibly alive for the season, heavy with the scent of herbs and those bruise-colored flowers. And there, in the center of it, stood matriarch Krista. She had not yet resumed the full horror of her true shape. Enough of the old woman guise remained that a stranger might still have been fooled, though the talons and the amber gleam in her eyes were impossible to miss up close. She had one clawed hand resting almost gently on Lena's shoulder, guiding the girl along a narrow path between the flowering beds. Lena's face was turned up toward her, listening with the rapt, slightly dazed attention of someone being shown wonders they had never imagined. In her hands she clutched a small cloth-wrapped bundle, the promised gift. Krista's voice floated across the garden, low and almost sweet. And these, child, are the ones that bloom only when fed the proper attention. A little blood, a little secret, and they open like the hands of the old gods themselves. You have a kind heart. The Reach has always had a place for kind hearts that are willing to learn how the deeper roots grow. Velkyre's burned voice tore out of him like a blade. Lena, step away from her. Now. Both figures turned. Lena's eyes went wide with relief and confusion. "Velkyre, you're hurt, your face, your arm." Grista's amber gaze snapped to him, then passed him to the open door of the house. For the first time, the perfect composure cracked. A thin thread of dark smoke was beginning to curl from the gaps around the warped windows. The Hagraven's nostrils flared. She had not yet understood the full scope of what was happening beneath her feet, but the scent of her burning sanctum had begun to reach her. Velkyre planted himself between the two of them, axe raised, every blistered inch of skin screaming, and met the matriarch's eyes across the beautiful poisoned garden. "We're leaving," he said, the words raw. "Both of us. And if you take one step closer to her, I will finish what the fire started." Matriarch Grista's amber eyes locked on the thin ribbons of smoke now pouring from the warped windows of her house, and something inside her finally snapped. The last remnants of the grandmotherly guise burned away like paper in a forge. Feathers exploded outward along her arms and spine, her spine elongated with wet, cracking sounds. The talons lengthened into black sickles. When she opened her beak-like mouth, the sound that emerged was no longer speech. It was pure ancient fury given voice. She lunged without warning. One moment she stood 10 paces away in the garden path. The next she was a blur of black feathers and scything claws aimed straight at Velkyre's throat. He threw himself sideways on pure instinct. The killing blow that should have opened his neck from ear to collarbone instead raked across the already scorched pauldron of his armor, peeling a strip of dark steel away like rind from fruit, and sending a spray of sparks into the afternoon air. The force of the near miss spun him half around. He came back with the axe in a desperate horizontal cut that forced her to rear backward, wings flaring for balance. They crashed together in the center of the garden. Blow for blow, steel against claw. Velkyre's axe rang off her reinforced forearms. Her talons scored fresh, bright lines across his breastplate and the exposed flesh of his burned arm. She was faster, stronger, driven by a rage that had just watched decades of carefully gathered power turn to ash beneath her own floorboards. He was slower, heavier, every movement paid for in blistered skin and the deep grind of injured ribs, yet he refused to give ground. They turned a full circle through the flowering beds, crushing bruise-colored blossoms underfoot, scattering herbs that released sharp, medicinal scents into the smoke already drifting from the house. Then Grista bared her beak and spoke a single word of power that tasted of sulfur and charnel pits. Flame erupted from both of her outstretched hands in twin torrents of white-hot fire. The magic struck Velkyre square in the chest. His dark steel breastplate drank the heat like a curse. Within heartbeats, the metal went from warm to scalding to the kind of searing temperature that made the air itself shimmer. The wax that had long ago been rubbed into the wolf and bear fur of his cloak to shed rain began to melt in thick, glistening runnels. The melting wax caught. Fire raced up the edges of the cloak and across his shoulders in a sudden, hungry bloom. The smell of burning hair and cooking leather filled his nose. His skin beneath the armor began to blister in earnest. Every breath was like inhaling the inside of a forge. He should have fallen. He should have rolled and screamed and tried to tear the glowing metal from his body. Instead, he lowered his head and stomped forward through the torrent. One step, two. The flames roared around him, turning the world into a tunnel of orange and pain. The axe felt welded to his hands. His vision narrowed until the only thing that existed was the Hagravene's snarling face and the shrinking distance between them. The metal of his armor glowed a dull, angry red at the edges. Wax and fur and skin all burned together. He was melting, truly, literally melting, and still he came on. 3 steps. 4. His knee gave out 5 paces from her. He dropped hard into the churned earth of the garden, one hand planted in the soil to keep from collapsing entirely, the other still gripping the axe, though the haft was hot enough to sear his palm. The torrent of flame washed over him without cease. Somewhere far away he heard Lena screaming his name. The last of his strength was pouring out of him like blood from an open artery. The thought of simply letting go, of lying down in the fire, and letting it finish what the silver hand and the Thalma and the long road had started, rose up with seductive clarity. Then the ebony arrow arrived. It came from the northwest without sound or warning, a black streak that seemed to drink the afternoon light rather than reflect it. The shaft struck Matriarch Grista dead center in the sternum with a deep, meaty thunk that cut through the roar of the flames. The force of the impact lifted the Hagraven clean off her feet and slammed her backward into the low garden fence. A torrent of fire died instantly. Both taloned hands flew to the black shaft protruding from her chest. Her amber eyes went wide with pure, uncomprehending shock, as though death itself had just broken a rule she had never believed could be broken. Velkyre did not waste the moment he had been given. He forced himself up on pure hatred and the last fraying thread of will. The axe rose. The axe fell. The heavy blade caught the Hagraven cleanly at the junction of neck and shoulder, and sheared through feather, flesh, and bone in one continuous brutal arc. Her head left her body in a spray of dark, smoking blood, and hit the garden path with a hollow final sound. The body stood for half a second longer, still reaching for the arrow in its chest, before it crumpled into a heap of black feathers and twitching limbs. Silence crashed down over the garden, broken only by the crackle of the burning house and Velkyre's own wet, ragged breathing. He turned. A quarter-mile to the northwest, atop a low rise of open ground, a lone figure stood watching. It wore armor of seamless, light-drinking ebony from gorget to greaves, the kind of plate that seemed forged from solidified midnight. No cloak, no banner, no visible weapon save the unmistakable silhouette of a longbow still held loosely in one hand. The figure did not move. It simply stood, helm facing him directly, and stared through him, as though measuring the exact weight of his soul against some private standard. The sensation that rolled across the intervening distance was not hostility nor friendship. It was a summons. A silent, absolute challenge to become something greater than the burned and broken man currently swaying on his feet in a Hagraven's garden. Velkyre tried to take a step toward that distant shape. His legs refused. The figure regarded him for one final heartbeat, then turned with unhurried precision and walked away down the far side of the rise, vanishing from sight as cleanly as if the land itself had swallowed it. The last of Velkyre's strength left him in a single soft exhale. He collapsed beside the headless body of Matriarch Grista, the world tilting into grey, then black, while the house behind him continued to burn and Lena's voice called his name from somewhere that already felt very far away.